In the spring of 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto became the scene of one of the most symbolic rebellions of World War II. Hemmed in by years of hunger, deportations, and terror, thousands of people trapped inside the ghetto decided to rise up against their oppressors. With barely any weapons and facing impossible conditions, the improvised fighters transformed ruins into trenches and resisted the Nazi war machine with a mixture of rage and dignity. The Third Reich's response was relentless. Commanding the operation was SS General Jürgen Stroop. He directed a meticulous and brutal repression. Day after day, his troops razed the ghetto block by block, using flamethrowers, explosives, and summary executions to crush any trace of resistance. When Stroop ordered the Great Synagogue of Warsaw to be blown up on May 16th, he did so as a symbol of the National Socialist victory. The Nazi occupation that dismantled an entire nation. In 1934, after a year in power, Adolf Hitler and the Polish Marshal Józef Pilsudski signed a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and Poland. Until then, relations were tense. Germany was demanding the return of territories ceded to Poland during World War I following the Treaty of Versailles, so Hitler's pre-war followers did not support this decision. For German citizens, it was important to regain possession of provinces such as West Prussia, Poznan, and Upper Silesia. However, Hitler ignored these opinions, as he had a hidden agenda behind his actions. His aim with this pact was to neutralize the possibility of a Franco-Polish military alliance against Germany. This would seriously hamper his goal of rearmament after the fateful war. On the other hand, France, like Great Britain, pursued a foreign policy of appeasement. After the tensions of the past, they yearned to maintain peace in Europe through limited concessions to German demands. For this reason, they agreed to some modifications to the territorial and military clauses of the Treaty of Versailles. Neither of these two nations felt inclined to wage war against Germany, so they safeguarded continental harmony. During this period, both the British and French authorities agreed to Germany's repeal of the restrictions imposed on its armed forces in 1935. A year later, they allowed the remilitarization of the Rhineland region, and in 1938 they did not oppose the annexation of Austria. Hitler took advantage of his colleagues' passivity and used their threat to start a war against Czechoslovakia to sign the Munich Agreement. This document consisted of the cession of the Sudetenland, a border region of Czechoslovakia. In return, the German Chancellor promised to resolve all future conflicts peacefully. However, his promise was short-lived. In March 1939, Hitler's men dismantled Czechoslovakia. Meanwhile, senior French officials offered guarantees regarding the integrity of Polish soil. However, Hitler did not have the same plans. He was determined not to deviate from his goal. On April 28, 1939, he announced his withdrawal from the non-aggression pact signed with Poland. Shortly thereafter, Hitler signed a pact with the Soviet Union. There, Hitler and Stalin secretly agreed on the division of Polish territory, which gave the German Chancellor the power to attack Poland without fear of intervention by the Red Army. To justify the attack, Nazi propaganda accused Poland of persecuting ethnic Germans living on its territory. It also falsely alleged a secret plan between Poland, France, and Great Britain to encircle and dismember Germany. The SS, along with the German armed forces, staged a fake attack on a local radio station and accused the Poles of perpetrating the attack. Hitler took advantage of this fake situation and warned that he would launch a retaliatory campaign. In the early hours of September 1, 1939, Germany launched a surprise attack on Polish territory. More than 2,000 tanks, supported by approximately 900 bombers and more than 400 fighter aircraft, entered Polish territory to begin the occupation. During the entire invasion, Germany deployed 60 divisions and 1.5 million men. Hitler's forces entered from East Prussia and Germany in the north and from both Silesia and Slovakia in the south. They quickly overcame Polish defenses and advanced toward Warsaw in a massive encirclement attack. The reaction from the Polish authorities was slow in coming, condemning the army to deploy at an absolute disadvantage. It is important to note that the Polish army did not have a large quantity of modern weapons or equipment. Furthermore, they had few armored and motorized units. The 300 aircraft they had in their possession were mostly destroyed in a matter of days. However, despite having zero armament power, the Polish army fought back and even inflicted heavy casualties on the German divisions. However, a few weeks later, the men achieved their objective and defeated their enemies. This swift strategy became known throughout the world as Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. Technically, this involves mounting a surprise attack with a large number of forces concentrated in armored units, which could move quickly while being supported by impressive air power. On September 3rd, the leaders of France and Great Britain contemplated this situation and declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. However, this aid was not enough, since while Poland was fighting, the Soviet Union began its invasion from the east, causing the Polish government to flee the country. On September 27, 1939, after a fierce bombardment, the city of Warsaw surrendered to the Germans. Both Hitler and Stalin respected their non-aggression pact, and 2 days later they divided Poland between them, marking the Bug River as the demarcation line. On October 6, 1939, the last Polish resistance ended. During October of that same year, Hitler and his Germany directly annexed the former Polish territories along its eastern border: West Prussia, Poznan, Upper Silesia, and the former Free City of Danzig. The remainder of the German-occupied sector of Poland, which included cities such as Warsaw, Krakow, Radom, and Lublin, was organized into the so-called General Government, or General Government, headed by the civilian Governor-General Hans Frank, who was also a Nazi Party lawyer. The Warsaw Ghetto is born. After the occupation, Hitler, along with the rest of the Nazi leaders, began to plan the isolation of Poland's Jewish population. From December 1st, according to the new Nuremberg laws, Jews were required to wear a white armband with a blue Star of David. Furthermore, they were not allowed to use public transportation or engage in certain professions. They were also not allowed to visit parks or restaurants. On October 16, 1940, after differing views among authorities such as Adolf Eichmann, the German Governor-General of Poland, Hans Frank, established the Warsaw Ghetto, which occupied 2.4% of the territory. At that time, it had a population of 380,000 people. It was the largest ghetto in Poland, with 30% of the population concentrated there. A few months later, in May 1941, the number rose to 445,000. Over the next 18 months, hundreds of Jews from the city and German towns were forcibly relocated to the ghetto. The population continued to be maintained due to the consequences of hunger and disease such as typhoid fever that prevailed in the ghetto. Food rations were limited to a mere 184 calories. In comparison, non-Jewish Poles consumed 1,800 calories and Germans 2,400. On November 16, 1940, the Germans closed access to the ghetto. They first surrounded it with barbed wire and then built a wall 3 meters high and 18 kilometers long. Within the ghetto, Jews organized themselves to achieve order and stable functioning. There were also organizations and institutions, such as various youth movements and the Judenrat, Jewish councils within the ghetto. In this way, they sought to combat the inhumane living conditions to which they were subjected. In addition to hunger, overcrowding in housing, inactivity among some, and poor working conditions in others were the main triggers for the formation of these groups. One of the most important actions taken by the Judenrat was to reduce the number of people per dormitory, reducing it to 7. They also took charge of hospitals and orphanages operating within the ghetto. One of these, known as the Children's Republic, was run by the educator Janusz Korczak, who in 1942 would be deported to Treblinka along with other architects of these organizations. Korczak was murdered at the Treblinka extermination camp that same year. American Jewish Joint Committee, known by the acronym CENTOS, organized canteens where free bowls of soup were provided, along with other food items. By 1941, CENTOS had fed 2/3 of the Warsaw Ghetto's population. In this context, the residents created a newspaper in 3 different languages: Yiddish, Hebrew, and Polish. They continued to commemorate various traditional Jewish holidays and held meetings with rabbis in private homes. Among the prisoners were dozens of violinists, players of various string and wind instruments, who had previously been jazz musicians and small band members. They secretly held concerts to entertain the other prisoners. There were also exhibitions and plays. On January 20, 1942, following the Wannsee Conference, the Nazi High Command decided to exterminate all Jews in Europe in what they called the final solution. they quickly began construction of the Treblinka extermination camp, which began in May 1942 and was inaugurated in July of that same year. On July 22nd, the Great Relocation Action began. All Jews were deported except those working in German factories, Jewish hospital staff, members of the Jewish police force with their families, members of the Judenrat and their relatives. Every day, the Jewish police were to bring approximately 6,000 Jews to the assembly point known as Umschlagplatz, located next to the Transfertel tracks. If this failed to happen, the Jewish commissars knew that the Germans would shoot hundreds of hostages, including the wife of Adam Chernyakov, the first leader of the Judenrat. On July 23rd, Chernyakov committed suicide, leaving a note saying, "I can't bear it any longer. My action will show everyone what must be done." Chernyakov refused to hand over a list to the Nazis containing thousands of names of children who were to be deported and massacred. For this reason, he chose to hasten the end of his life. After this tragedy, suicides became a common occurrence. The Jewish captives could no longer tolerate the mistreatment they had received and suspected that worse was to come. On the same day of the suicide of the Judenrat leader, the Jewish resistance met and decided not to revolt, as they believed they were being sent to forced labor camps, not extermination camps. By September 21st, more than 260,000 people had been sent to Treblinka and, to a lesser extent, to Majdanek. Between August and September, the Germans and Allies took a more direct role in the deportations, increasing the number of Jews the Jewish police could transport. Compared to the approximately 65,000 deported by the Allies, the Nazi forces transported more than 142,000 in August and nearly 56,000 in September. Between September 6th and 11th, 1942, the final phase of the first mass deportation took place. In those days alone, nearly 36,000 Jews were deported, more than 2,600 were executed, and 60 committed suicide. After this first phase, approximately 55,000 captives remained in the ghetto. 30,000 men worked in various German industries, and 20,000 were in hiding. In contrast, 8,000 Jews were hidden outside the Warsaw Ghetto. The Jewish resistance begins to organize. During the second half of 1942, the underground Jewish resistance grouped into two larger organizations. It all began when the young men of the Hashomer group Hatzair, a socialist Zionist Jewish youth movement, declared in March of that same year the following: "We know that Hitler's system of murder, slaughter, and robbery constantly leads to a dead end and the total destruction of the Jews." This article prompted the need to create a self-defense group. After a meeting coordinated for that same month, prior to the deportations, the Hashomer organization Hatzair proposed the creation of a self-defense organization. However, the Bund, a non-Zionist Jewish communist movement, rejected this proposal because they believed the plan would fail without the help of Polish resistance groups, which had previously rejected any collaboration with such causes. For their part, the Judenrat leaders sided with the Bund's response, believing there was no evidence of a threat of deportation. They also feared collective reprisals against the Jewish community. On July 23, 1942, the various underground political factions met secretly but failed to reach a consensus. A few days later, on July 28, representatives of the Hashomer Zionist organizations Hatzair, Habonim Dror, and Bnei Akiva met separately from the parties and created the Żydowska organization Bojowa, or the Jewish Fighting Organization, known as the ZOB. This group had between 220 and 500 members. The ZOB was primarily made up of members of what in Hebrew is known as the Tenuat, Noah, which stands for Jewish Zionist movements. These are educational organizations formed by and for Jewish children and adolescents. Their purpose is to transmit various values for the educational, social, and ideological development of their members, with an emphasis on Zionism. The ZOB members suspected that Hitler and his men were seeking to annihilate all the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, so they began shifting their educational and cultural focus to teaching self-defense and armed struggle. Their attempt to convince the older generations failed, as they believed the German reports, which concealed the purpose of extermination behind deportation. Itzhak Kukierman, known as Yitzhak Zuckerman and also by his nickname Antek, was the leader of the ZOB. Kukierman described the conditions surrounding the creation of this organization. At that meeting, the youth groups decided to establish the Jewish Struggle Organization just by ourselves, without political parties or the support of the Judenrat. Representatives of the ZOB were transferred to the Aryan side of Warsaw. The goal was to foster ties and establish connections with Polish anti-fascist resistance groups, such as the AK, which stands for Armia Krajowa. However, this failed not only because the AK was insufficiently armed, but because it rejected the ZOB's leftist ideology and its leaning toward the Soviet model. The ZOB quickly published propaganda urging Jews to take up arms and not allow themselves to be annihilated so easily. Now our motto must be, "Let everyone be clever and die like a man. Let us not be slaughtered like sheep to the slaughter," their leaflets read. One of the ZOB's greatest achievements was seriously wounding the head of the Jewish police, who was a Nazi collaborator. The Jewish police were staffed by Jews but supervised by Nazis. The residents of the Warsaw Ghetto viewed this as a betrayal and no longer trusted the police force. The ZOB began to view them as collaborators and issued decrees stating that they would execute anyone who aided the Nazis. Nazi forces managed to capture some ZOB officials and assign them to carry out deportations. The organization was left in a state of disarray, but equilibrium was achieved when they allied with Jewish groups in Hanor, Hatzioni, and Gordonia. Simultaneously, a group of non-Zionists from the Bund joined, and Mordecai Anielewicz, former head of Hashomer Hatzair, became the new leader. Later, another infiltrator was found as an informant for the Nazis. His name was Dr. Alfred Nossig, a man revered within the community. On January 18, 1943, Nazi forces began a second wave of deportations. Among the convicts were some members of the ZOB, including Anielewicz, who had intentionally camouflaged themselves. After a signal, this rebel group walked in formation and fought the Nazis at gunpoint. The column dispersed, and the ZOB gained notoriety. Until then, they had not been very popular in the ghetto, as ordinary people trusted the Judenrat more. After Cherniakov's suicide, the Jews of the ghetto lost hope, so discovering the ZOB brought them a new hope, marked by armed rebellion. Another organization that generated enthusiasm in people was the ZZW, Żydowski Związek Wojskowy, i.e. Jewish Military Union, which had a similar number of members as the ZOB. The ZW leaders and members were convinced that if they wanted to win, they had to aggressively resist oppression. Their weapons consisted mainly of pistols and revolvers, homemade explosive devices, and Molotov cocktails. The ZW was better armed than the ZOB, as it had clandestine contacts outside the ghetto, such as the AK. Emanuel Ringelblum, a Polish Jewish historian who managed to escape from the ghetto but was discovered and subsequently murdered in 1944, visited a ZW armory hidden in the basement of Muranovska Street. In his notes he wrote, "They were armed with revolvers on their belts. In the spacious rooms hung various types of weapons, light machine guns, rifles, revolvers of various types, hand grenades, ammunition bags, German uniforms, etc., all of which were used to the fullest in the April action. During my stay there, a purchase of arms was made from a former Polish army officer worth 250,000 zlotys. A sum of 50,000 zlotys was paid on account. 2 machine guns were purchased at 40,000 zlotys each and a large quantity of hand grenades and bombs." Members of the ZOB and the ZZW held several meetings with the aim of reaching an agreement and merging into a single organization to face a new challenge, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. However, the ZOB considered itself the main organization in the ghetto, while the ZW believed it had better training, greater education, and superior weapons. The ZW sought to lead the action due to its superior military preparation and, in turn, disagreed with the insurgents' weapons being stored in joint warehouses. The ZOB also requested that, in the event of a possible alliance, ZZW subordinates join the ZOB individually and not as a complete organization. At the same time, the ZZW distrusted the Bund, which maintained close relations with the ZOB due to its contacts with Polish socialists. For this reason, no such alliance existed, and both organizations continued separately. On January 21st, after capturing between 5,000 and 6,000 ghetto residents for deportation, German soldiers decided to suspend the deportations. The resistance groups celebrated this news and felt they had taken a major step. However, they knew they couldn't trust the enemy, so they built underground bunkers and shelters in case the Nazis decided to reactivate one last deportation and an uprising became necessary. The ZZW and the ZOB were right. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising would become a reality. The last battle of the Warsaw Ghetto. On April 19th, Pesach, the Jewish Passover, began. Even in hostile times, the Jews of the ghetto observed their customs and traditions, finding a reason to celebrate in the darkness. German forces took advantage of the relaxation and entered the ghetto in the morning. As planned by the German officers, the ghetto streets were deserted. The remaining inhabitants hid in hiding places or bunkers. One of the post-war survivors, Marek Edelman, who was part of the resistance, said the following in an interview conducted by journalist Hannah Krall in 1977. That day, the liquidation of the ghetto was supposed to begin. We received phone calls from the Aryan side that the Germans were already preparing, that they had already surrounded the walls. On the evening of the 18th, the five of us met at Anielewicz's house, the entire general staff. I was perhaps the oldest. I was 22. Anielewicz was a year younger. In short, the five of us together had a total of 110 years. Hearing the boots of more than 2,000 soldiers, followed by loud words in German, the ZOB and the ZZW went on alert, ready to resist. Commander Mordecai Anielewicz commanded the approximately 70 Jewish fighters who were armed with rifles, a few automatic weapons, pistols, and homemade grenades. Although the Germans expected they would encounter resistance from the captives, they were surprised to find they were prepared for combat. At the very beginning, SS Commander Jürgen Stroop reported the loss of 12 men, killed and wounded. The German reaction came on the third day. The police forces and Stroop's brigade waited until April 21st to show their rigor. They ferociously entered each of the homes, bunkers, and hiding places. The resistance made sporadic attacks while seeking protection. The days passed and the streets of the ghetto were filled with rubble. On May 8th, Anielewicz and his men fought against dozens of German soldiers, but they were unable to counter their power. Anielewicz was killed instantly at 18 Mila Street. Few men were able to resist, but some managed to survive for nearly a month. The city was in ruins, but in Stroop's eyes, one last move was missing. With deep hatred, he ordered the destruction of the Great Synagogue on Tlamaki Street. By May 16th, Stroop reported that he had captured more than 50,000 Jews and destroyed 7,000 bunkers. After intense fighting, the Germans had won. Stroop sent a photograph to Himmler and left the following message: "The Warsaw Ghetto no longer exists." Some of the resistance leaders took their own lives, preferring instant death to capture. 7,000 Jews were murdered in the gas chambers of Treblinka. Nearly 42,000 were transported to the Lublin Majdanek concentration camp and the forced labor camps of Poniatowa, Troniki, Budzin, and Krasnik. Many of them were killed in Operation Harvest Festival in November 1943. This was the code name for the extermination of all the Jews in Lublin. This operation began on November 3rd and was intended to instill fear in those who rebelled against them. By systematically murdering Jews, they sought not only to terrify them, but also to ensure that a new campaign of resistance would not begin. However, this operation was not only triggered by the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Throughout Poland, Jews were rebelling to save their own lives. Prior to the Harvest Festival murders during the fall and spring of 1943, in addition to Warsaw, a group of Jews in the town of Białystok resisted the Germans. On August 2nd of that same year, Jewish prisoners at the Treblinka extermination camp fought against the Nazis in search of their freedom. On October 14th, the captives staged an uprising that resulted in the escape of 300 prisoners, of whom 58 survived the war. Following the prisoner uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor, the extermination camps of Action Reinhard were liquidated. Following an order from SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, the Harvest Festival began on November 3rd, when more than 43,000 individuals who had failed to escape from the camps were liquidated. SS officers and police surrounded the Troniki and Poniatowa labor camps. They quickly rounded up all the Jews and shot them in specially dug pits. At Majdanek, Nazi forces separated the Jews from the rest of the prisoners, gathered them with other inmates from various labor camps in the Lublin area, led them into trenches, and killed them. At both Majdanek and Troniki, German officers played loud music over the loudspeakers so that the rest of the prisoners could not hear the sound of weapons or the screams of the victims. In Poniatowa, the shootings lasted 2 days, while in Majdanek and Troniki they were carried out in just 1 day. The figure of 43,000 Jews murdered places this massacre as the second largest execution of the Second World War, only surpassed by the Odessa massacre in October 1941, where the Nazis murdered more than 50,000 Jews. Revisiting the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Jewish resistance managed to thwart the German forces' plans. While the Nazis intended to liquidate and destroy the ghetto in 3 days, thanks to the uprising of the ZOB and the ZZW, the fighting lasted just under a month, beginning on April 19th and ending on May 16th. Even after the uprising ended, individual Jews, hidden among the ruins, continued to attack German patrols and auxiliary troops. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising left a lasting mark on the history of warfare. In addition to being the largest uprising, it was also the most significant Jewish resistance movement, becoming the first urban uprising in Europe since Hitler came to power. It also served as inspiration for other acts of rebellion. In the Bialystok Ghetto, the Minsk Ghetto, and the Treblinka and Sobibor extermination camps. All of these movements were inspired by the events in Warsaw. One of the resistance leaders, whose identity remains unknown, reflected on the imperative to fight, despite knowing they would be defeated. We saw ourselves as underground Jews, doomed to a tragic fate. Our time had come, there was no hope or chance of rescue, we had to fight. These words sum up an act of courage. The Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto were not fighting merely to survive. They were fighting to prove that they would not die without first proving their worth, that they would not die in vain. When the art and history of Poland were taken away by the Nazis, during the years of World War II, Polish Jews suffered irreparable damage, not only materially but also emotionally and spiritually. The Germans robbed them of their culture and their everyday life. All of this was strictly calculated and was part of the general Plan Ost, which consisted of, in addition to shootings and annihilations, the colonization and Germanization of the various occupied territories. The main architects of this change were Hans Frank, governor of the general government in Poland, and Joseph Goebbels, Nazi minister of propaganda. Under the belief that Poland did not deserve to be considered a cultured nation as soon as they occupied Polish territory, they banned cinemas, theaters, radio, the press in general, education, and even cabarets. Instead, they forced them to watch films highlighting the achievements of the Third Reich and spoke to them through megaphones. They quickly closed the editorial office where the only Polish-language newspaper in the country was published, while intellectuals were arrested. In 1940, all cultural activities were placed under the exclusive control of the Department of Popular Education and Propaganda, later renamed the Main Propaganda Department. Only low-quality shows of an erotic or pornographic nature were allowed to continue, so that the world could see not only the supposed quality of Polish culture, but also to avoid believing the country lacked cultural expressions. Hitler's men summoned various foreign critics to assess the quality of the shows. A few months later, Polish-language books were banned, publications were halted, and most existing titles were censored. Meanwhile, the Germans, supervised by the Einsatzgruppen, the Haupttreuhandstelle, Ost, and the SS Anhennerbe looted art objects and took them to Germany. By 1942, 90% of Polish artwork, according to Nazi government data, was in the German nation. Some of these works were exhibited at the Führer Museum in Linz, Austria. There were works by Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Rembrandt, and others. They stole more than 500,000 works of art, including nearly 3,000 paintings by European painters, 11,000 by Polish painters, 1,400 sculptures, 75,000 manuscripts, 25,000 maps, and 90,000 books. They even took exotic animals from zoos. As the months passed, centers of learning and culture, such as universities, schools, libraries, cinemas, theaters, and museums in Poland, were closed or designated as Nur für Deutsche, German for Germans only. They were strictly forbidden to enter religious buildings, and even Polish was banned from church services. Of the 175 museums that existed in Poland before the war, only 105 were able to survive, and only 33 reopened to the public. Of the more than 600 scientific institutions, half were destroyed and very few survived intact. During the Sonderaktion Krakow, an operation against professors and academics at the Jagiellonian University and other universities in Krakow, and the massacre of the Lwów professors, Poland lost a large part of its professionals. Over the course of the war, Poland lost half of its doctors and dentists, many of its lawyers, nearly 25% of its teachers, and 20% of its clergy. Poles were left with almost nothing, yet they continued to fight for their rights and freedoms. Armia Krajowa, Poland's hidden force. Several years before the creation of the ZOB and the ZZW, there was a resistance organization that sought to confront German power. On September 27, 1939, a group of Polish resistance officers formed the Służba, two-handed Polski, which in English means service for the victory of Poland. In January 1940, the ZZW Związek emerged from this organization. Walkie Zbrojne, League of Armed Struggle, known as ZWZ, commanded by Rowecki, Grot. In 1942, its name was changed to Armia Krajowa, meaning Home Army. In 1943, Grot was arrested, and his successor was Tadeusz Bor Komorowski. Between 1941 and 1944, Armia Krajowa began to actively take revenge on its invaders. They derailed nearly 700 trains, blew up 40 bridges, carried out 25,000 acts of sabotage, and executed 570 attacks against the occupying forces. From 1943, within the armed struggle, the group was organized into guerrilla teams and participated in more than 170 battles against the Germans. During the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, they played a key role and later helped free prisoners and hostages during attacks against German forces. They organized various raids and intelligence operations. They eliminated prominent Nazi collaborators and Gestapo officials. Together with Great Britain, they designed a powerful spy network spread throughout Poland. With absolute discretion, they sent messages to London. There they were received by exiled members of the former Polish government, who in turn forwarded the messages to the British intelligence services. Krajowa participated in important operations during World War II, such as Operation Garland in 1942, where they sabotaged Nazi rail transport, Operation Belt in 1943, which consisted of a series of attacks against Nazi border posts on the border between the General Government and the territories annexed by the Third Reich, and Operation Tempest in 1944, based on a series of nationwide uprisings aimed at taking control of cities and areas where Nazi forces were preparing defenses against the Red Army. One such uprising was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Other symbols of this operation are the uprising known as Operation Ostra Brama in Wilno and the Lwów Uprising against the Soviets. During the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, 2 all-female units were created, as 10% of the Armia Krajowa were women: Demolition Unit and Sewer System Unit. Many of them participated in the Warsaw Resistance as medical personnel, serving as nurses, doctors, stretcher-bearers, or messengers. By the end of the uprising, 5,000 women had died, while 2,000 were imprisoned. Most of them were sent to Stalag 6, Camp Oberlangen. Krajowa was one of the teams that, in the face of adversity, fought without giving in. Al Frente, People's Army. Another Polish resistance group was the Armia Ludowa, created in the final stretch of the war in 1944. A few years earlier, a movement called Guardia had begun to form Ludowa, which meant the People's Guard was sponsored by Polish communists exiled in the Soviet Union. On November 1, 1944, the National Council of State formalized it and contributed both troops and weapons. With this collaboration, its membership quickly grew from 10,000 to 40,000. In Armia, Ludowa was a mixture of Red Army officers, partisans, and Polish civilians of communist affiliation. They had fewer troops than Armia Krajowa, but Soviet material aid was important to have greater armament resources. In any case, Armia Krajowa was better structured, and its men had greater discipline. Army Ludowa, also known as AL, took part in 900 operations, killed over 20,000 Germans, derailed 350 trains, and destroyed nearly 80. However, these numbers have been disputed, as post-war communist propaganda in the Polish People's Republic would have exaggerated the feats. According to Polish historian Piotr Gontarczyk, only 5 to 10% of AL actions took place during World War II. Furthermore, not all of the Germans killed were part of the military forces, but several of them were civilians. Polish-born American historian Mieczysław Biskupski mentioned that AL gave more importance to fighting Armia Krajowa than against German soldiers. In fact, she claims they used to make anonymous calls to the Gestapo reporting on the actions of the Germans. Krajowa. 500 men belonging to the AL were sent to the Warsaw Ghetto to fight against the Germans. As the months passed, Armia Ludowa lost Soviet support, so they resorted to looting to obtain weapons, troops, and supplies. They also requisitioned churches and mansions to survive. In February 1944, during the period when they were still called Guardia Ludowa, they seized an important army file Krajowa and confiscated it. The rest was handed over to the Gestapo. As a result, 7,000 men were taken prisoner. Warsaw rebels. In addition to actively participating in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Armia Krajowa was instrumental in the Warsaw Uprising. During 1944, Polish authorities in exile and leaders of the Armia Krajowa disbelieved in possible support from the Soviet Union and understood that they would have to defend themselves alone against the German attack. A year earlier, during the Katyn massacre, the Red Army made its intentions clear by murdering thousands of Polish officers. In recent months, they observed how Stalin's men collaborated in the liberation of other European countries and understood that Stalin would not seek to restore democracy to Poland, but rather a new Soviet occupation. For this reason, from exile, the Polish government ordered Armia Krajowa, which was tasked with liberating Poland before the arrival of the Red Army. On July 13, 1944, Soviet forces reached the former Polish-Soviet border. The men of Armia Krajowa knew that the Soviet Union had accused them of collaborating with the Nazis and calling them cowards. They also had the precedent of the Warsaw Uprising, in which members of Armia Krajowa who were captured ended up executed or captive in the Soviet gulags. On July 27, Hans Frank ordered 100,000 Poles to build numerous fortifications in various parts of Warsaw. The AK leaders saw this action as intended to dismantle the resistance. For this reason, they persuaded civilians to disobey the order. At the same time, Soviet propaganda continued to discredit the Armia Krajowa, accusing them of not wanting to fight and of waiting idly for the Red Army to return their freedom. A day later, the first Soviet troops were positioned on the banks of the Vistula River to fight the Germans in the Battle of Radzymin. The AK was concerned that the Germans would discover that Polish civilians had disobeyed their request for fortifications, so they opted to bring forward the uprising and, on the 1st of August 1944, began to mobilize. The Polish army numbered 50,000, including men, women, and children. From this group came 23,000 veterans who had no experience as regular soldiers, but rather as partisan fighters. They included not only members of the Armia Krajowa, but other independent partisan groups answered the call, including some Jews who had managed to escape from the Warsaw Ghetto. They were organized into 8 areas and had the following armament: 1,000 rifles, 60 submachine guns, 1,700 pistols, 300 automatic pistols, 25,000 grenades, 35 anti-tank weapons, and 7 machine guns. In addition to this arsenal, the Western Allies delivered various weapons to Warsaw. During the fighting, the factories were able to stockpile 300 automatic pistols, 150 flamethrowers, 40,000 grenades, a large number of mortars, and an armored car. On the opposing side, 16,000 Germans were prepared to resist, while another 90,000 soldiers were stationed in various regions surrounding Warsaw. The uprising took place on August 1st. German forces learned of the enemy's plans from a Polish civilian woman. Although they didn't have time to develop a strategy, Nazi troops were able to mobilize to prevent the uprising. The uprising had relative success in the center and the Old City, but the Germans' Krajowa suffered heavy losses in Wola, Warsaw's 4th district. In Mokotów, a major district of the Polish capital, the Germans left the Polish dissidents without a chance. In Praga, a small district located on the east bank of the Vistula River, Polish forces were forced to return to their hiding places after discovering a high concentration of enemy forces. Given this situation, the outcome of the action was disappointing. They had managed to recapture large areas but were unable to establish contact with each other. Having lost the initiative, the AK had no choice but to build barricades throughout the city and adopt a defensive stance. On August 4th, 3 days into the adverse action, the Polish Home Army occupied a large number of areas. Meanwhile, German Army General Erich von dem Bach Zelewski received the reinforcements he had requested, and together with them pressed for contact with isolated pockets of Germans. On August 5th, the AK managed to occupy the ruins of the ghetto. That day, German Lieutenant General Heinz Reineffath received Hitler's directive, ordering him to turn the city into a lake. Reineffath took note of the request and began what became known as the Wola Massacre, which lasted until August 8th and, according to various sources, resulted in a death toll of between 40,000 and 100,000. With this type of action, the Nazis believed they would demoralize their enemies and force them to surrender. However, the Home Army understood this massacre differently. Seeing that all those captured were instantly killed, their willpower increased as they had no choice. It was kill or be killed. The German commanders took note of this and, after a reasonable period of time, treated the detainees as prisoners of war. On August 5th, dozens of German tanks rolled into the city with Polish civilians clinging on as human shields. After 2 days of heavy fighting, the German army managed to cut the Wola district in two and reached Bankowy Square. Between August 9th and 18th, fierce battles broke out between Nazis and Poles, drenching the entire old town and the area around Bankowy Square with blood. The Luftwaffe bombed hospitals with Red Cross flags, as it had during the invasion of Poland, killing hundreds of doctors and nurses. By the end of August, the Poles had to withdraw from the old town. On September 2nd, nearly 6,000 men and women retreated through the sewers, which at that time were an important means of communication and transportation for the resistance. With the arrival of German bombers and the Mörser Gerät ZU supergun, a self-propelled siege mortar, the defeat of the resistance was assured. Meanwhile, AK members watched sadly as dozens of buildings were demolished. Poland under the Soviet fist. While Poland was suffering under the might of Hitler's forces, it was also being humiliated by the Red Army and the Soviet government. On September 28, 1939, following the secret signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviets began similar abuses to those of their later enemies, the Germans. In territorial and geopolitical matters, the once sovereign Lithuania came under Soviet control under the name of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. Thus, the demarcation line that ran through central Poland was shifted eastward, granting the Third Reich a larger share of Polish land. For its part, the Soviet Union seized the lands east of the Pisa, Nariu, Bug and San rivers. This entire territory covered approximately 200,000 square kilometers and was home to nearly 14 million people. It is important to note that at no point did the Soviet Union officially declare war on Poland, and from the very beginning of the invasion, it stopped recognizing the Polish state as such. The Soviets did not classify Polish military personnel as prisoners of war, but rather as rebels against the new Soviet government. Initially, more than 250,000 Polish POWs were captured in the borderlands by the NKVD during and after the invasion. The situation for these captives was uncertain and desperate because the Soviet Union had not signed any international convention on rules of war, so they were denied legal status. Captured officers were either killed or sent to the Soviet Gulag. During the Katyn massacre, this same secret police annihilated approximately 22,000 Poles. Throughout the invasion, the Soviets killed tens of thousands of Polish POWs. Stalin and the rest of the Soviet authorities accused the pre-war Polish state of committing crimes against the revolution. Therefore, once in power, they proceeded to arrest a large number of intellectuals, former civil servants, clergymen, politicians, and scientists. They also imprisoned ordinary citizens who were considered a threat to the Soviet regime. In the first 2 years, the prisons held approximately 500,000 Poles. Among those arrested were former Prime Ministers Leon Kozłowski, Alexander Prysta, Stanislaw Grabski, and Stanislaw Glabinski. Renowned journalists and poets such as Władysław were also deprived of their freedom. Broniewski, Alexander Watt, Leopold Lewin, Tadeusz Piper, Teodor Parnicki, Marian Chuchnowski, and Anatol Stern. Show trials were the order of the day, and more than 65,000 Poles ended up behind bars through this means. From the beginning of the occupation, the Red Army sowed confusion among the inhabitants of Poland. It quickly spread the word that its arrival would protect and save them from the Nazi threat. The Soviet advance surprised all Polish communities and their respective leaders. who had not been advised on how to respond to a Bolshevik invasion. Initially, both Poles and Jews preferred the Soviet regime to the German one. However, Stalin's forces proved to them that they were no kinder than Hitler's men. They could be just as hostile and destructive regardless of the ideologies involved. The Soviets began their plan of confiscation, nationalization, and redistribution of Polish property, both state and private. In addition to requisitioning all types of goods, they also confiscated food. The NKVD, in turn, initiated an agrarian reform program in which the owners of large tracts of land were labeled kulaks and therefore dispossessed. These tracts of land were distributed among peasants and low-income people. However, they also initiated a process of forced collectivization. This action nullified all the political gains that had been achieved prior to the agrarian reform. But the situation continued to prevail in Poland. In addition to prison sentences, deportations were rife. In the first 2 years alone, 100,000 Poles suffered this harshness firsthand. Prisons became overcrowded, and detainees were accused of anti-Soviet activities. Cities in the region were filled with makeshift prisons created by the NKVD. The prisons were overwhelmed, and the invaders had no choice but to build new ones. Approximately 1 million Poles were sent to Siberia, 55% of whom were women who suffered brutal and harrowing sexual violence. Another large number of deportees ended up in Khabarovsk Krai and Kazakhstan. At the same time, Polish identity was losing its value. The Soviet government did not appeal to racist foundations to generate policies. On the contrary, they sought to instill Soviet ideology through Stalinist measures. The ultimate goal was to achieve the complete Sovietization of the territory along with the Russification of the region. They sought to disseminate the language and culture in the countries they conquered. On October 22, 1939, they held staggered elections for the Supreme Soviets within the legislative body. The result indicated the Soviet annexation of eastern Poland. Subsequently, Polish state institutions were dismantled and closed, only to be reopened under Soviet-appointed supervisors. Some cultural and educational institutions, such as Lwów University and other schools, soon reopened but began to operate as Soviet institutions. Russian language and literature were required subjects. These measures sought to erase the Polish language, which was not included in regular education. Gradually, the universities of Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Lviv opened. The Sovietization plan moved forward relentlessly, achieving its goal. Any trace of Polish history or any element that left a mark of the Polish state was completely eliminated. On December 21, 1939, the Polish currency was withdrawn from circulation and replaced with the Soviet ruble. This meant that both the savings and immediate spending money held by Poles were void. Absolutely all businesses were taken over by the Soviet state. On the other hand, agriculture was collectivized. The media passed into the hands of Stalin and his men. All political parties and similar organizations were dismantled. Only the Communist Party was allowed to exist. Furthermore, all religions were censored, including synagogues, churches, and various religious temples. Stalin held a particular grudge against the Polish state and dreamed of dominating it. He wanted to transfer Soviet culture and ideology, completely displacing everything associated with a sense of Polish belonging. To this end, recalling the past ethnic tensions that separated Soviets from Poles, Stalin and his men ordered the Red Army forces to incite and encourage violence against Poles. They tirelessly repeated that they could rectify the grievances suffered during 20 years of Polish rule. Pre-war Poland was portrayed as a capitalist nation based on the exploitation of workers and ethnic minorities. Soviet propaganda exploited these slanders, claiming that the unfair treatment of non-Poles by the Second Polish Republic unequivocally justified its dismemberment. Soviet officials publicly incited murder and robbery. How the Allied Pact affected Poland's post-war political future. On July 30, 1941, Poles and Soviets established diplomatic relations through the Sikorski-Mayski Agreement, signed in London. There, Polish Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski and the Soviet ambassador to the United Kingdom, Iwan Mayski, discussed the conditions and sealed the pact. Following Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union that began on June 22 of that year, Stalin urgently needed help from countries fighting against or simply opposing Hitler's nation. British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden contacted Sikorski to begin negotiations with Mayski and resume diplomatic ties. After the signing, an additional military alliance between the two forces was achieved on August 14th in Moscow. Consequently, Stalin declared null and void the pacts he had previously signed with Nazi Germany, which included agreements and concessions between the two nations. He also agreed to the invalidation of the Polish partition and the release of tens of thousands of Polish prisoners of war held in various Soviet camps. On August 12th, Polish citizens and prisoners were granted amnesty. Shortly afterwards, they formed new military forces known as the Anders Army, supervised by General Władysław Anders. However, relations between the two countries remained tense because the whereabouts of many Poles remained unknown. This situation continued for 2 more years. In 1943, the Soviet Union and Poland broke off relations and continued their enmity, as they refused to provide an independent examination of the recently discovered Katyn burial pits. In June 1944, the deportations continued. Nearly 40,000 soldiers and officials of the Polish underground state refused to join the Red Army. A year later, 50,000 more people were deported to forced labor camps. In the fall of 1944, nearly 25,000 Polish underground fighters, including 300 high-ranking officers, were captured by NKVD units and Smersh operational groups and deported to the gulags. By 1945, German forces began to be pushed westward. Poland's formal sovereignty was re-established by the Provisional Government of the Republic of Poland. However, the country remained under military occupation, controlled by the Soviet Northern Group of Forces for many years. Between 1944 and 1946, thousands of Polish independence fighters fiercely opposed the new communist regime. Fearing no consequences, they attacked national offices of the NKVD, Smersh, and the Polish Communist Secret Service. Political leaders were kidnapped by the Soviet Union and then interrogated under torture. They were later imprisoned. None of them survived. At the same time, nearly 600 people were killed in the Augusto Raid, a Soviet military operation against Polish partisans and anti-communist sympathizers during World War II. During this period, rapes of women increased sharply, especially in mixed Polish-German areas such as Silesia, Masuria, and Pomerania. Women returning from forced labor in Germany were sexually assaulted by Soviet soldiers. The Soviet Union continued to exercise power in Poland until 1991, after the Cold War. At that point, Polish citizens regained their freedom, and the Republic of Poland regained its independence. That was all. See you next time.